All right, Ms. Rabb, let's start with you. For the record, your name is Jennifer Rabb, and you are testifying on behalf of the Texas Taxpayers and Research Association. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for having me here to testify today. Thank you for listening. The Texas Taxpayers and Research Association has existed for about 50 years, and we advocate for tax policy that is good economic policy. And in our book, good economic policy is that which contributes to economic growth and jobs that ultimately provide income and homes and other good things. I have a handout that is being passed out now. It has a cover page. I'm starting with how does Texas state and local tax, short acronym SALT, compare to other states? So Texas is already a desirable place for individuals to live from a tax perspective. In FY21, which is the latest data available, so that was before the 2023 tax relief, Texas had the 11th highest property tax burden for individuals among U.S. states and the 36th highest or 14th lowest total state and local tax burden for individuals in the United States. And here's a table in the packet that looks like this that shows you these two rankings. So both of these rankings, again, were before the 23 property tax relief. So we expect that our rankings for individuals have improved since 2023 with both the compression and the homestead exemption, the increase in the homestead exemption that happened in 23. Now moving on to how our business tax environment compares to other states. So first I want to say we approach this from the perspective that Texas is competing for capital investment with other states and of course other nations. So according to FY23, tax year 22, which is the latest data available, so again this is before the 2023 tax relief, Texas had the 20th highest effective tax rate for businesses among U.S. states, and the tables look like this in the packet, and the 15th highest state and local tax burden per employee compared to other states. So again, this is before the 23 relief, so Texas may have improved in these rankings since that time. We don't know because the rankings also take into account what other states have done in the meanwhile. An important thing to know is that property tax relief that was enacted in 2023 is paid for by general revenue, which is mostly contributed by businesses, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Also, this table that is in the handout, according to the Tax Foundation's 2025 State Tax Competitiveness Index, so this is the latest data we have, and it does take into account the 2023 relief. We were the 40th most competitive, so right down near the bottom on property tax, and we were the 7th most competitive overall. And we have that variation because our property tax system has a couple of features that are not favorable in this indexing. One is that we tax business personal property, and we also have a split roll for school tax, which I'll talk about more in a minute. There are other factors, but we rank so high overall because we don't have a personal income tax, and that factor is more heavily weighted in this index than the other factors. I'd like to mainly spend my time today to talking about how we would recommend that the legislature undertake property tax reduction with the long run in mind. And I'm moving on to this page of my handouts, property tax reduction for the long run. So from our perspective, we will make Texans better off in the long run by property tax reduction that focuses on reducing taxes on invested capital in Texas. And why is that? Because invested capital leads to jobs, which leads to income, which leads to homes, and leads to all kinds of other good things. The 2023 property tax relief actually shifted the school tax burden to some degree from homeowners onto businesses, and that is going to be this table in my packet. So the 2023 tax relief, because it was mostly homestead exemption and also some compression, about 86% of the 23 tax relief benefited single-family homes, and 14% benefited businesses. The shift of the tax burden from business to homeowners, which is this bar chart on the left of the table. So after the 2023 tax relief, you have 43% of homestead value on the tax rolls, and you actually have 93% of business property on the tax roll. So when I refer to a split roll, that's what we're talking about. You're taxing 43% of homesteads, 93% of property value. And what's really significant about this is that this difference is now baked into the Constitution because the homestead exemption is in the Constitution. This is a difficult imbalance for the committee to address, for the legislature to address, but we do have a suggestion, which we'll get to in a moment. Also, on the right part of this page, the map, the red counties in this map are the counties that have an average home value less than $100,000, less than the current homestead exemption, and that's 307 school districts, or 30% of school districts. So one concern that we have as an association with a homestead exemption is that when you have a significant number of property owners who are not paying school tax, we have concern about what that does to their incentive to vote for M&O tax increases and new debt that they themselves will not have to pay. So we think that's an important consideration. The only source of revenue to pay for more compression or more homestead exemption, although that's not before this committee, is general revenue. And so next in my packet is this table, which shows who contributes general revenue, and this is taken from the latest biennial revenue estimate done by the Comptroller's Office, as well as the tax exemptions and incidence report published by the Comptroller. Of the taxes that go into general revenue, because there is also investment income and other things that go into GR, of the taxes contributed to general revenue, those are paid 56.4% by business, or that's the estimate for FY25, and 43.6% by individuals. So the way to think about this, we believe, is that as you are using these state dollars to compress school district tax rates, consider that those state dollars are contributed 56% by business, paid 56% by business. So if the school property tax relief majority benefits homeowners, you are then more shifting the tax burden to business in the grand scheme of things. Also in the packet is the incidence of the property tax relief fund, which was created when the margin tax was enacted in 2006, and it is really a subset of GR, but 99% of the money in the property tax relief fund comes from taxes paid by businesses. So looking forward to this session and additional property tax relief, we encourage you to think about the property tax burden in relation to personal income. And so that is this table, this graph in your packet. So our goal, I think, the legislature's goal should be to ensure that property tax levies do not grow faster than personal income. As long as income is growing faster than taxes, most people will be able to afford to pay their property tax. Not everyone, because someone loses a job, they're on a fixed income, that's a different situation. But in the scheme of things, as long as income is growing faster than property tax, we're probably in good shape. So what this shows is where we were both before and after the 23 property tax relief. Okay, so the bars on the bottom are total levies in the state adjusted for population and inflation and their growth over the last 30 years. So this is population and inflation adjusted, which is super important because when you have an inflationary environment, as we almost always have at least a little bit of inflation, and you have a growing population, if you just look at any tax levy unadjusted, it's going to move up and to the right at a 45-degree angle. That's just going to happen. And so if you want to get a real sense of how much the tax burden has grown, you have to adjust it for population and inflation, because only that's giving you a sense of how much bigger the burden is. And so the bar chart on the bottom shows you that at the high point of property tax levies, which was in 2022, levies had grown 68% since 1994, whereas income had grown only 55%. So at that point, you had levies growing faster than income, or property taxes growing faster than income. But after the 2023 relief, you can see in 2023, levies had grown 48% on a population inflation adjusted basis since 1994, and personal income had grown 57%. And so that's the relationship that you want. You want your income to have grown faster than property taxes, and that happened because of the 23 relief, and also because of the 2019 limits on growth of property tax levies. And so this, I think, is super important as you decide how much more property tax relief is important. This shows us that this is something that we have to continue to monitor in terms of what that relationship is. But also the important thing to know is that regardless of that relationship, the lower the tax burden on capital, the more capital you attract to Texas, the more investment you get, the more jobs you get, the more incomes grow, and all of those good, you get a sort of virtuous cycle there. So we think that future property tax reduction should focus on compression, because compression is distributed equally across all value on the tax roll. So even if you have a split roll situation, compression still is reducing taxes proportionately across all value that remains on the roll. We also would like to ask you to consider a business personal property exemption, which Chairman Meyer is obviously considering. She filed HB 9, so thank you for that, and we look forward to working with you on that bill. So on the right of this table is the original, the current situation, 43% of homestead value on the roll, 93% of business property on the roll. If you exempted 100% of business personal property, that 93% of business property on the roll would come down to 78%. So that would close our split roll. It wouldn't remedy it, wouldn't eliminate it, but it would help to improve the situation. Unfortunately, exempting all business personal property is very expensive, and that's this table in your packet. This shows at different percentage levels of exemption the cost per year. So I think, Chairman, your $250,000 exemption, the $700 million a year, that would approximate a 20% business personal property exemption. If you wanted to exempt the whole shebang, that's about $3.4 billion a year. So that is a lot of money. But also at the same time, increasing the homestead exemption would exacerbate this split roll, and we, TARA, are officially neutral on increases in the homestead exemption, but we do have concerns about them, and that is our job as TARA to come here and tell you what our policy concerns are. One policy concern is increasing the split roll situation. The further concern is that this is a structural change. It's in the Constitution. It's never going away once it's in there, because voters would be unlikely to vote for it. And also, as I mentioned before, the motivation of a homeowner who doesn't have to pay for, to vote for tax increases that they wouldn't themselves have to pay for. Finally, property tax reduction in the long run, we believe, should focus on controlling tax rates. That is the most effective way to control property taxes. Compression works. Compression of M&O rates work. That's what you see here. It does work. So that we support. But unfortunately, as the state spends state dollars to compress school property taxes, that property tax reduction can be eroded by increases in other taxes, and that's this last page, I think, second to last page of your packet. The state bought effectively about $5.2 billion of school property tax reduction in 2023, and that's M&O reduction. School districts increased INS taxes by over $800 million, which brought the school tax reduction down to $4.3 million, and then counties, cities, and special districts increased their taxes by $3.9 billion. So in the end, property owners saw just over $400 million of property tax reduction. And so how do you prevent that erosion of property tax reduction? Again, it is about limiting the growth of tax rates. Governor Abbott mentioned this in the State of the State address. He referred to as closing loopholes in the no new revenue tax rate and voter approval tax rate calculations. We think that is very important. Also requiring greater transparency on debt rates and the connection of new debt and debt rates to property tax reduction. The governor also mentioned requiring a supermajority for tax rate increases. That makes sense. You know, when you put a bond proposition and you're asking people to vote for it, you know, is that you might say that's self-harm. You go vote for that, and that is self-harm because you've raised your taxes, unless you really, really want and need the thing that the bonds are going to support. Finally, removing value from the tax roll is not effective at reducing tax rates, whether it's through a homestead exemption or any other kind of exemption, unless the state is making up the difference, and that's what is happening with school tax. The state makes up the difference, but in other taxes, when you take value off the roll, that doesn't bring taxes down because tax rates can automatically increase. It is a fundamental feature of our property tax system that as values go down, tax rates can go up so that taxing units can raise the amount of revenue they need. So it doesn't ultimately work in reducing property taxes. It just creates certain irrationalities in the system. That's the end of my remarks. Thank you very much again for having me, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you. Representative Barbara Kervin Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jennifer, you know, I think you gave a great presentation. I'd like some clarity on some things, though, and to find out what we, as a state, have done to look at truly the 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 40-year. So we're cutting property taxes, which is great, and we're picking up that burden. We've limited cities and counties on putting caps on them, what they can do. Have we looked at a whole infrastructure of when we do all of these things, okay, do we have an algorithm to be able to plug in all of these things we're doing and know what that impact is going to be? Because no doubt it sounds really good and people are happy and all that, but at the end of the day, will we come to the ledge at some point? And then we've got to reverse all this stuff.
Yes, it's very difficult. Is there one algorithm overall? No, because each and every taxing unit in this state acts independently of every other one. There are 4,500 or so independent taxing units, and you've got, you know, 5 or so people, let's say on average 5 people on the governing bodies of each of those taxing units who each is making an independent decision. So is there overall an algorithm? There isn't. But I do think that controlling tax rates does get you ultimately to what we're trying to accomplish, which is to ensure that property taxes don't grow uncontrollably. And there are things we can do to control property tax rates better than we have in the past.
And I concur with you in terms of the various taxing entities. When I look at the bill, you got the junior, you know, the colleges, you've got the, you know, health, you've got county, you got all of these things. Would you, or have y'all even thought about us having a statewide, unified taxing situation? Have you thought about those things? Have we as a state thought about it?
Well, the Constitution prohibits that, so it would require a constitutional amendment. We can't have a statewide property tax under our Constitution. And I guess I would submit this to you. if we had some kind of statewide property tax system, we would have to develop some way to fund local governments by which the state would funnel money to local governments. And we already have a system similar to that called public school finance. So if you would like to multiply that across all, I don't think we do, but I think that it would take something like that.
Really?
Yeah.
But it is the belief that we're headed in the right direction.
Yes.
And that our
yes.
future is bright.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, any other questions? No. Thank you for your test. Do you have it? No. Yes, Representative Perez.
I just had a question. I mean, we talked about, I guess, the impact on homeowners, would really benefit from the homestead exemption, and then, now talking about the business exemption, but really left out of this equation for the most part are renters, right? And I guess that's always been one of the big issues is that, here in Austin, about nearly half of all people who live here in Austin are renters. And a lot of this, property tax relief, whether it goes to, the homestead exemptions, which provides one method of relief, and, or the business property tax relief, doesn't necessarily trickle down to renters, which is a huge portion of Texas' population. Do you have any thoughts or analysis on that?
Well, it is a factor outside our control, and we rely on the market to deliver the tax reductions ultimately to renters. But I guess the thing that I think is missing from the conversation about renters is that renters are not directly on the hook for property tax. They are not at risk for higher property taxes because think about when you sign a lease and when your property tax has to be paid. Let's say you sign a lease for January 1 through December 31st of 2025 and the rent is set in the contract, and that's all whatever the rent amount is, that's all the renter is obligated to pay. But the tax rate and the amount of property tax due on that property is not determined until the end of the year. And the landlord is on the hook for whatever that amount is. So if the property tax is actually higher than the landlord estimated when they set the rent, the landlord bears that. If it's lower, then the landlord gets that benefit also. But that's the system that is. It's different, of course, for commercial and residential properties. Commercial tenants typically, my association, for instance, we rent commercial office space, and the property taxes are passed through directly to us in a triple net situation. So as renters, we are on the hook for higher property taxes, but residential renters typically are not, because residential leases typically are not structured in that way.
But they do see increases. I guess if they renew their lease, that's what contributes to a lot of the jumps in rent. Yeah.
So let's say, taxes go up in 2025 and they renew for 2026. Well, maybe the landlord raises the rent in 26 because 25 taxes were higher, but that still doesn't mean that 26 taxes are going to be yet higher. The landlord is still on the hook in 26, and it just goes on like that forever.
But the landlords do receive their appraisal. Earlier in the year, so they do have an estimate before, like giving your example.
No, they actually don't, because the appraisal doesn't determine how much tax you have to pay. The amount of tax you have to pay is not determined until tax rates are set later in the year.
Okay. Thank you.
Members, any other questions? Thanks for your testimony. Appreciate it. Let's move on to Mr. Holbrook from Every Texan. For the record, your name is Shannon Holbrook, and you're testifying on behalf of the group Every Texan. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Please proceed.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. Appreciate your having us. It's great to talk to you all today. So I've provided some written testimony. It's a couple pages of testimony and then some backup materials as well. I'm just going to summarize a little bit of that, and then happy to take any questions. So first of all, a big policy priority for Every Texan this session is that we have no new property taxes. Last session we had huge cuts to the tune of 18 billion or so, which, as it turns out, it's going to be more like 22 billion. And we think that it's time to preserve some of our excess revenue, some of our carryover balance, to help our schools, to fund those, to provide health care for our low-income and elderly citizens, infrastructure, and the list goes on. Also, I appreciate Mr. Reynolds from the Controller's Office pointing out that the carryover balance that we had last session, which was historic, $33 billion or so, and then the smaller but still huge carryover balance that we have this session, those are really, really due to kind of the one-time events surrounding the COVID pandemic. And it's not something we can expect to see going forward. And I really appreciate him saying that because it means that the commitments that we're making to cut taxes now will reverberate over and over and over again for every biennium going forward. And, as we all know, we have downturns sometimes and we don't have revenue and we have to figure out where to cut sometimes. So, all that being said, though, that's one of our policy priorities, but we do know and we acknowledge certainly that many Texans are still struggling with the cost of housing. Texas has the 7th highest property taxes in the country. We know that 3.7 million Texas households are housing cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 30% in housing, and this includes 51% of renter households as well. So, that being said, we prefer not to cut taxes, but if you're going to do it, we want to see it done in the most equitable way possible. And that means that we provide equitable benefits to the communities that really need the most help. So first of all, just to think about our tax system, we know that our tax system overall is a regressive system. According to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, we have the 7th most regressive tax system in the country. A lot of that is because we rely so heavily on our sales tax, which is inherently regressive. And we know also that according to the exemptions and incidents report, which just came out from the Controller's Office, about 14, or actually more than 14% of the lowest income Texans pay, let me restate that. The bottom 20%, the lowest income Texans, pay about 14% of their income in state and local taxes, whereas the wealthiest Texans pay under 4% of their income in state and local taxes. So that's the regressivity in action there. So anyway, if we're going to have tax cuts, we really want to maximize the equity of those. And I ask you to look at the chart in your materials on page 2. It's not the second page of the document, but it's marked page 2 on the page number. That top chart there looks kind of like this. It says most property tax cuts unfairly benefit the wealthy. Once again, these data are from the most recent exemptions and incidents report, and it just sort of gives an overview of the different ways that exist to cut property taxes and the relative incidence of those methods, right? So the sort of each group, of each quintile here, we see the bar on the furthest left represents the flat homestead exemption. And we see that kind of has the flattest curve, right? That has the most equitable impact across the income spectrum. Whereas other methods, for example, an appraisal cap or a percentage homestead exemption, both of those actually see a situation where the top quintile receives over 50% of the benefit of those methods of cutting taxes. So again, if you're going to do it, we really want to see it done in a way that prioritizes equity. A couple of things too about appraisal caps I just want to mention. First of all, they're a less equitable way to cut property taxes, but they also shift the tax burden, from established, wealthier homeowners to newer homeowners to business, et cetera. And, that's something we don't like to see. And rate compression as well, it has an inequitable impact. And so that's something that we also kind of want to stay away from too. So I want to mention just a few other options, a few more sort of aspirational options that the legislature could consider in trying to cut property taxes and really get the most bang for the buck in terms of helping people who really need help the most at minimum cost. First of all, we know we have the flat dollar homestead exemption for school districts. We would love to see there be a flat dollar local option homestead exemption for cities and counties. Cities and counties can do a percentage exemption, but not a flat dollar one. So that's one thing. Renters credit or rebate, getting to Representative Perez's question about renters, that would be an easy way at minimal cost to sort of help renters. We do know that renters pay property taxes. Obviously, a portion of their rent could be considered to go to pay towards the landlord's property taxes, but I think the evidence is a little bit murkier that property tax cuts provided to landlords actually trickle down and are experienced by renters. I personally like the circuit breaker option that basically reduces property tax values according to a person's ability to pay. It's a really versatile policy that's employed by about 30 states. It can be applied to homeowners and or renters, and I think we can have a good policy like that for about $2.5 billion. And then finally, this is the most aspirational thing, but a state earned income tax credit would help a lot of Texans at minimal cost as well, especially lower income folks. Last thing I guess I would mention is just, we'd love to see a reevaluation of some of the exemptions. Once again, going back to the controller's exemptions and incidents report, the business and professional services exemption is something we point to, I think, every session. That's about $12 billion or so in foregone tax revenue. For the most part, folks at the lower end of the income scale spend more of their money on goods. Wealthier Texans spend more on those services, professional services, lawyers, accountants, et cetera. And so that would be, a good source of revenue. And then there's the high-cost natural gas exemption, the exemption on property for data centers, et cetera. So there's some things to consider there as well. I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions if you all have.
Chair recognizes Chair Capriglione. Oh, you just were pointing at me. Okay, very good. Members, any other questions? All right, thank you, sir, appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Quintero, let's move on to you. For the record, your name is James Quintero, and you are testifying on behalf of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Very good, sir. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members, James Quintero, Texas Public Policy Foundation, here to articulate a few high-level thoughts on the state of play with respect to today's property tax system. I actually want to begin by praising the efforts of the legislature and its persistent attempt to lower taxes. And in fact, as everyone here knows, last session, state lawmakers passed a historic $18 billion tax relief package that employed an all-of-the-above approach to return ample surplus back to taxpayers. And as a result of the legislature's leadership, it was anticipated that the average homeowner would experience a reduction in their tax bill of $1,266 in year one and $1,312 in year two. And of course, thanks to the leadership here, we also added a bit of a sweetener for the elderly and disabled. Their projected tax savings was estimated to be a slight bit higher at $1,436 in year one and $1,482 in year two. Now that's a historic measure of tax relief, but it is not some one-off event either, and rather it's the latest in a series of attempts to meaningfully reduce the tax burden in Texas. Other recent attempts to lower taxes include 2019's $5 billion tax rate compression, 2021's $800 million homestead exemption increase, and of course, this legislative session's $6 billion proposal. Thus, in three of the three last legislative sessions, policymakers have taken concrete steps to lower taxes and appear poised to do so again. Now, here's the bad news. In spite of all of this very good work, many Texans feel overwhelmed by the current property tax environment. And as evidence, what I'd like to point you to is some latest polling data from WPA. This is one sheet in your handouts. This is a new February 2025 poll of nearly 1,000 registered voters. And what it shows is that 83% of survey respondents strongly or somewhat agree that property taxes represent a major burden for them and their family. 18% of respondents strongly or somewhat disagreed with that sentiment, and 4% did not respond. So we have more than 8 in 10 Texans agree that taxes today are a major problem in spite of the legislature's efforts. And as you'll see on your sheet, what that figure has done over the last several years is increased noticeably. In fact, since April 2022, the number of people expressing alarm with the state of play has risen by 12 percentage points. So what does all of this information tell you? Well, to me, it suggests two things. One, the legislature is doing its part on tax relief, and two, most people aren't feeling it. So what's the problem? Well, I believe it comes down to one factor, and that's local government excess. Here's what I mean. There seems to be a tendency among cities, counties, and school districts to erode state-directed tax relief through aggressive rate hikes, large bond elections, and an overutilization of non-voter approved debt instruments like certificates of obligation. These are intentional policy choices that have the effect of frustrating the legislature's intent and keeping the cost of government high. And I'd like to punctuate that thought with a little bit of local data. So to their credit, Travis County actually does a fine job of estimating and relaying what the average homeowner's total tax burden is. And here's what they show over the last couple of years. In 2023, the average Travis County resident shouldered a total tax bill of $9,219. This is prior to the legislature's major tax relief initiative in 2023. In 2024, that tax bill, that same property owner's tax bill, was actually reduced to $8,873 as a result of compression and homestead exemption increase. In 2025, which would be year 2 of the tax relief package's effect, the same individual's tax bill rose to $10,356, which is about $1,100 more than that initial 2023 amount. What this shows is that the legislature, despite having appropriated enough for that person to hypothetically enjoy $1,300 of tax relief in year 2, saw their tax bill radically increase. And so this raises the question, what are the factors that prompt such a dramatic increase in this community's tax bill? Well, again, I go back to the terrible trio of rate hikes, bond elections, and COs, and I want to punctuate that point with a little bit of data and evidence as well. So staying here in Travis County, consider some of the things that happened over the last few years since the implementation of that 2023 tax relief measure. In June of 2024, Austin ISD adopted a tax rate that increased the average taxpayer's bill by $290. And as was pointed out by Representative Troxclair, shortly thereafter, the district held a voter approval tax rate election that added another $494 to that person's tax bill. The sum total of those two actions, those two rate hikes, was to add almost $800 to the average taxpayer's bill. That is an astounding amount that erodes more than half of what was intended by the legislature. Now let's move on to bonds here quickly. In November 2022, Austin ISD proposed a $2.4 billion bond package, knowing the tax relief was likely on the way. That package was the largest in the district's history. In November 2023, Travis County pitched and passed its own largest bond package in the county's history, and possibly next year, Austin City Council may approach voters with a $1 to $2 billion climate bond to fund a range of environmental projects. I'm not sure if that's the largest bond in the city's history, but it's large by my measure. Now, of course, the net effect of taking on all of this new debt here in Travis County is that their tax bills are increasing radically. And of course, there's also the matter of COs. It's worth noting that in December 2022, again, shortly before the start of the last legislative session, Travis County opened its new civil and family courts facility. This facility was constructed through the issuance of $333 million of COs. What's really frustrating about that particular instance is the fact that voters had actually turned down that same project several years prior at a normal general obligation bond election, and yet county officials utilized COs to go around that decision and do it anyway. Now, these are, of course, I understand that a majority of this body does not represent Travis County, but I dare say that some version of these happenings are occurring throughout the state, right? I think in many communities we see aggressive rate hikes, large bond elections, and the issuance of COs to a degree that is concerning, and it is taking away from what the legislature has done both in 2023 and prior. And so in light of previous experience and our current predicament, my plea to the legislature today is twofold. One, go big, and two, guard the gains. And here's what I mean by both. When I talk about going big, I hope the legislature will seek a higher measure of tax relief. In fact, the foundation is in lockstep with the governor's office. I believe that $10 billion or more is the right figure when it comes to tax relief. So I want to encourage the body to consider that. This would represent a substantial investment in taxpayer well-being and a responsible use of surplus monies. And of course, as we all know, the state is well positioned to deliver such relief. We have not only a large general revenue related surplus of $24 billion this biennium, but also $27 billion in ESF balance expected by FY 2027. So I hope, again, that the body considers going bigger. Now, when it comes to guarding the gains, I'm talking about tax reform. I believe we need to institute strong new taxpayer protections that ensure whatever relief is provided by the legislature lasts. And so to help the body consider a few ideas, what I've done is I provided a list of 35 different recommendations in this handout. I've even tried to color code them by type, articulate what the problem is, and provide a solution. The proposals are broken down by M&O, INS, and other reforms. I, of course, don't have time to go through all 35, but what I'd like to do is just touch on one in each category and then hopefully answer any questions that you might have. So to the M&O reforms, one thing that I think the legislature ought to consider is bringing uniformity to the voter approval tax rate system. What I mean is when the legislature first adopted that 2019 reform, there were several carve-outs included in the law that allowed cities under 30,000 population to still observe that old system that allowed for an 8% revenue increase and still has a petition process. A similar dynamic is in play for community colleges and hospital districts. I think all taxing units ought to be subject to one easy to understand revenue limitation, whether it's 2.5%, 3.5%, that's your decision, but there ought to be one simple measure applicable to all taxing units across the state. Secondarily, one thing that I've noticed here recently is that local governments don't like being told no. And what I mean specifically is in the INS, when it comes to bonds and INS reforms, one thing I hope the body will consider is instituting a cooling off period after failed elections. We had an incident last year with Willis ISD. It approached voters for the third time in 2 years with the same or substantially similar proposition, and voters again said no. But there's no reason that voters should be put in that position where after they said no once or even twice, that a governmental entity comes back with the same question. I think that's egregious. I think it's akin to a child pestering a parent for a piece of candy. And the legislature ought to take steps to make sure that the voters' decision is respected by that taxing unit. And then the last item that I'll touch on is the most important in my mind. I think a lot of the things that we consider here are very important with respect to controlling the property tax, but the most important thing that we can do to control the burden of government is to institute a local government spending limit. What I mean is we need to apply the same standards that the state observes down to the local level. And right now, for those of you who may not know, the state is subject to 5 different statutory and constitutional spending restrictions. We ought to take 1, 2, or all of those restrictions and apply it down to the local level, because until we get a handle on local government spending, we're never truly going to do right by taxpayers, because governments will find a way to squeeze taxpayers for whatever money they need. With that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions.
Chair recognizes Representative Gervin Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you're talking about taking away local control?
Ooh, good question. So it depends on how you define it, right? In my mind, the truest form of local control is individual empowerment. And what I'm trying to do is empower the individual to make financial decisions and decide what to do with their money. So to the extent that we can place reasonable constraints on government and allow an individual to exercise discretion with their budgets, I believe that's actually honoring local control.
So continuing putting caps on what local governments can do, because every community is so different. And I think that having the voters come out and vote 10 times, as long as they vote it down because that's their will, and or vote people out, give the individuals the independence that they need. So what you're proposing is saying the state is the big daddy, and big daddy is telling everybody else what to do.
Good question. So, a couple of things there. One is I would challenge the notion that it's a cap. It's not a cap, it's a trigger. If the local taxing unit can actually exceed that level of revenue if they go and ask for voter permission. A true cap would say local governments, you're no longer allowed to get more than 3.5% in new revenue, and I'd actually be okay with that, but that's not what's in place today. When it comes to the dynamic between state and local governments, one thing that I would urge the body to consider is the fact that the legislature is the author and creator of political subdivisions. And by virtue of that position, it has the responsibility to make sure that its local governmental entities are acting in such a way that it is not trampling on the life, liberty, and property rights of those in its jurisdiction. And where those grievances are found, then it has the duty to take corrective action. So,
Thank you for your opinion, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Appreciate it.
Members, any other questions? Chair, recognize Representative Perez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a former county elected official, one thing that we would often talk about is unfunded mandates, and those also place pressures on all of our localities. So when you're doing this analysis, when a lot of the cities and counties do have to raise property taxes to meet these are essential services that these local governmental entities are providing. Some like 85% of our budget at the county goes to criminal justice services, right? Funding our courts, funding our sheriff's department, and all that. And I just use Operation Lone Star as an example. When the state ultimately made the decision to convert immigration-related cases, which had traditionally been a federal issue, and made that a state jail felony and a state misdemeanor, all of a sudden, all these guys who were arrested on the federal side and were the responsibility of the U.S. Marshal now comes on county government, because these are now county prisoners. And so now we have a flood of folks, which should traditionally be the responsibility of the federal government. But those are the types of pressures that county governments encounter. And I'm just wondering, I don't disagree with you that there's a lot of pressure to, on these local entities, but, when we're talking about this, is that calculated at all, when looking at the value? A few years ago, the legislature, passed a law, which I think was very worthwhile, to give 100% exemption to certain disabled veterans. The issue with that is that, we still have to pick up trash, we still have to provide police service, we still have to provide fire, we still have to fund a sheriff's department for that particular household. But those are the types of things that often get passed, but there's no compensation for that. So, there is. Ultimately, it is the local taxpayer, and that's where they have to provide the revenue for that. So I just ask, is any of that calculated when we're talking about increases that these localities, looking at the issue of unfunded mandates and perhaps the increase of that over time?
well, first, thank you for your service. My wife is a local elected official. I know what kind of a commitment it is. And so thank you for all of the things that you did to advance the interests of your community at that level. On the question of unfunded mandates, and I go back and forth with her as well, I actually I empathize with local governments and the position they've been put in, and I want to extend an offer to you that where we can identify specific unfunded mandates to potentially target and ease some of the spending pressures at the local level, I want to be a resource and help you where it makes sense, right? I think there are certain perhaps critical law enforcement related unfunded mandates that we may not be able to come to an agreement on, but I am happy to work with you toward that goal, because I want less government at the end of the day. And if that means upending certain unfunded mandates, then I want to be there and help you along in that goal. So I'm in partial agreement, and I want to be a resource, and hopefully that's a good answer.
Members, any other questions? All right, very good. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, members, is there any other business to be discussed before we adjourn? And just before we